if you're old enough to, remember the American sitcom Friends. You might recall an episode in which Monica and Chandler fake their own engagement in order to avoid the prying eyes of their nosy parents. But when the ruse is almost discovered, Chandler has a change of heart and proposes to Monica for real. "Will you marry me?" he asks, and she says yes. They kiss. Cue the romantic instrumental music. What if I told you that this happy ending was a cheat? That even though it looked spontaneous, this proposal had actually been meticulously planned, weeks in advance by none other than Joey Tribbiani. You see, while everyone was focused on Ross's relationship drama, Joey was secretly orchestrating his friend's romance with a well-timed series of phone calls. And when the time was just right, he dropped the ultimate hint, telling Monica, "You know, there's nothing more romantic than a guy getting down on one knee and saying, 'Will you marry me?'" This perfectly set up Chandler's proposal, so that when he asked the question, Monica was primed to say yes. Hi, everyone! Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to learn about the untold story of 1876, a year many Americans consider their greatest, but which also includes a hidden deal that changed the course of U.S. history forever. As always, to really understand what happened, we have to go back even further. In the 1840s, the United States acquired vast territories in the West. By 1859, this land encompassed a staggering 31% of the entire nation. But there was a problem. While people were eager to move out west and claim homesteads, there weren't many efficient ways to travel such long distances. Sure, the Oregon Trail had been well established for decades, but conditions were rough and dangerous. Plus, most people couldn't afford months out of their lives to haul themselves and their possessions across the continent in a wagon train. In fact, few Americans could even fathom the sheer size of the country they inhabited. The concept of cross-continental travel seemed like little more than a fantastical fairy tale. But then in 1862, the Pacific Railway Act was passed, which authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. After several years of work, it was finally completed on May 10, 1869, connecting the eastern states with California at a place called Promontory Summit. People could now travel halfway across the country in less than 2 weeks. However, despite this progress, there was still no practical way to get to the eastern Pacific coast. You see, the nearest rail line to the ocean from Promontory Summit was in a small settlement called Beller, Utah, a distance of roughly 120 miles. To cover this final stretch, passengers had to board horse-drawn coaches and endure a bone-jarring ride over rutted dirt roads. Then once they arrived in Beller, they would need to find alternative transportation to reach the nearest jail with rail service, which was nearly 200 miles away. But this wasn't ideal. Travelers didn't want to switch modes of transportation. They wanted a seamless journey from New York to San Francisco. At this point, 3 railroad companies were vying for the opportunity to complete the last mile of track and claim bragging rights for building the world's first transcontinental railroad. Each company sent representatives to Washington, D.C., where they met with government officials and lawmakers in hopes of striking a deal. But no agreement could be reached until a relatively unknown senator named John F. Miller intervened. He proposed that instead of awarding the contract to just one company, why not form a partnership where all 3 could share the cost and the rewards? This way, the project wouldn't be bogged down by bureaucracy, corruption, or competing interests. After careful consideration, the 3 companies accepted Miller's proposal and agreed to join forces. But before they could lay down any track, they needed to sign a deal that outlined each company's responsibilities and how profits would be divided. So, in secret, the executives met together and drafted up a contract. This arrangement would give them a monopoly on railroad construction in the western United States for the next 20 years. No other company would be allowed to build a railway in this region without first obtaining permission from these three. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with Joey Tribbiani? Well, here's the thing. Most Americans aren't aware that this secret deal exists at all, because it was deliberately buried. See, in 1872, President Ulysses Grant appointed pro-railroad tycoon Jay Gould to the Interstate Commerce Commission, the federal agency tasked with regulating the railroads. But after a series of controversial decisions, it became clear that Gould was using his position to benefit private companies at the expense of the public. So, when his term was up for renewal in 1876, Congress decided not to reappoint him. This created a major conflict between the executive and legislative branches of government. President Grant threatened to veto any legislation that removed Gould from office. But Congress refused to back down. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and Gould was allowed to stay in office for years. However, behind the scenes, congressional leaders made a secret deal with the three railroad companies in exchange for keeping Gould in office. They agreed to bury the details of the Pacific Railway Act of 1864, which authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. Now, you might be asking yourself, why would they do this? Why hide the fact that America had successfully built a railroad from coast to coast? Well, it turns out that by 1876, people were already talking about building a second transcontinental railroad. And if the public knew that the first one had been secretly monopolized by just three companies, they would have been outraged. That is, because people began to suspect that the Pacific Railway Act had been nothing more than a giant scam cooked up by wealthy businessmen who bribed corrupt politicians. For example, the Central Pacific Railroad Company received 100 shares of stock for every mile of track they built. This meant that the company was guaranteed a profit no matter what, regardless of whether or not they actually provided a useful service to customers. In addition, they were given 200 acres of land for every mile of track they laid down, granting them ownership of massive swaths of Western real estate. In fact, by 1876, the Central Pacific owned more land than 20 of the 30 states east of the Mississippi. This led to accusations that the railroad executives were simply land speculators who planned to sell off the property for huge profits as soon as possible. By hiding the details of the original railroad deal, Congress hoped to avoid public backlash and maintain support for future infrastructure projects. They effectively wrote the first transcontinental railroad out of history books, erasing any mention of it from official documents and records. This allowed the three railroad companies to operate under the radar and continue profiting from their monopoly. As a result, it wasn't until the early 20th century that Americans learned about the Pacific Railway Act and the shady deal that allowed just three companies to control the vast majority of U.S. railroads. But by that time, it was too late. The damage had already been done. These companies had stifled competition, raised prices, and hobbled the American economy. It took decades to break up their monopolies and restore fairness to the railroad industry. So there you have it, the secret deal that nobody knew about for 100 years. It is a fascinating example of how even the greatest moments in history can be tainted by corruption and deceit. And who knows what other hidden truths are waiting to be uncovered? Now, it's time to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this secret deal? Do you think it was right for Congress to hide the truth from the American people? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked this video, please don't forget to subscribe. We've got lots of fascinating historical tales to share with you, and we'd love for you to join our growing community. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.